The conference room on the 42nd floor of Meridian Tower held 200 people that Tuesday morning. Executives and department heads gathered for the quarterly review that would determine next year's budget allocations. The presentation screens glowed with charts and projections, the smell of fresh coffee mixing with expensive cologne, when Regional Director Victoria Ashford spotted the coffee stain spreading across the carpet near the refreshment table. She stopped mid-sentence. Her heels clicked against the hardwood as she crossed the room, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "You, janitor, what is this?" Marcus Cole stood near the coffee station, his gray uniform pressed and clean, a mop handle resting against his shoulder. He looked at the stain, then at her, his expression unchanged. "I asked you a question." Victoria's voice carried to every corner of the room. "This is a $60,000 presentation, and you can't even keep the floor clean? This is exactly why some people never rise above their station." Marcus said nothing. His phone buzzed once in his pocket, a familiar 3:15 reminder, and his eyes flickered down for just a moment before returning to meet hers. The whispers started. 200 people watched, and not one spoke up. Victoria smoothed her jacket and turned back to her presentation. Behind her, Marcus was already on his knees, cleaning the stain with methodical precision, his movements unhurried and exact. The coffee had been spilled by a junior analyst who now stared at his shoes, saying nothing. Within 20 minutes, the carpet showed no trace of the incident. Marcus gathered his supplies, checked his watch, and returned to his routine as though the last 15 minutes had never happened. His cart moved silently through the hallway, each bottle and cloth arranged in precise order, labels facing outward, handles aligned. The quarterly meeting resumed. Victoria Ashford concluded her presentation to polite applause, secured her budget increase, and never looked toward the hallway where the janitor had disappeared. But something had shifted in that room. The junior analyst who'd spilled the coffee kept glancing at the door. 2 senior managers exchanged looks but said nothing. And in the security office on the ground floor, an older guard named Raymond Briggs watched the incident on camera, his coffee growing cold in his hand. Marcus finished his shift at exactly 5:30, as he did every day. He changed in the maintenance locker room, trading his gray uniform for worn jeans and a plain black jacket. His locker contained nothing personal except a photograph taped to the inside of the door, a little girl with his eyes and her mother's smile, gap-toothed and laughing at whoever held the camera. He drove a 12-year-old Honda Civic with 180,000 miles on it, the kind of car that required weekly attention but refused to die. The drive from downtown Chicago to his apartment in Cicero took 45 minutes with traffic, and he used that time the same way he used most of his time, in silence, planning, preparing. The apartment was small but immaculate. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a kitchen that had seen better decades. But the floors were clean enough to eat from, the windows clear, every surface organized with military precision. On the refrigerator, a child's drawings hung in neat rows, each one dated in the corner with careful handwriting. Sophie Cole was 7 years old and waiting for him at Mrs. Patterson's apartment 3 doors down. She launched herself at his legs before he'd fully stepped through the door, her small arms wrapping around him with the desperate strength of a child who'd learned too early that people could disappear. "Daddy, Mrs. Patterson taught me how to make cookies, but we have to wait for them to cool down or we'll burn our tongues, and she said maybe next time we can make brownies. But I told her you make the best brownies because of the secret ingredient." Marcus lifted her easily, settling her against his hip. "Did you finish your homework?" "Most of it. I got stuck on the math part because fractions are stupid." "Fractions aren't stupid, they're just patient. They wait for you to understand them." Patterson, a 73-year-old widow who refused to accept more than grocery money for watching Sophie. "Thank you, Margaret. That child is a blessing." Mrs. Patterson pressed a container of cookies into his free hand. "I'm working exactly hard enough. They ate dinner together at the small kitchen table, spaghetti with sauce from a jar because Marcus had never learned to cook the way his wife had, the way Emily had made everything taste like home. Sophie chattered about her day, about her best friend Keiko who had a new puppy, about the book they were reading in class, about the spring concert where she wanted to sing a solo but was too scared to audition. "What's the worst thing that could happen?" Marcus asked, twirling noodles around his fork. Sophie considered this seriously. "Everyone could laugh at me. And then what? And then—" She frowned. "I don't know. I'd be embarrassed? For how long? Maybe a day? So one day of embarrassed, against maybe getting to sing a solo. What do you think?" She poked at her spaghetti. "You always make things sound so easy." "Not easy, just clear." He reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "You don't have to audition, but you should know that being scared isn't a good enough reason not to try something." Later, after homework and bath time and 3 chapters of Charlotte's Web, Marcus sat in the dark living room and let the silence settle around him. His phone showed no messages. The television stayed off. On the wall, a single framed photograph showed a younger version of himself in dress uniform, standing next to a woman with laughing eyes and Sophie's smile, taken 3 months before a drunk driver ran a red light and changed everything. He didn't think about the conference room. He didn't think about Victoria Ashford's voice echoing off the walls, or the 200 people who'd watched and said nothing. Those things belonged to a category of experience he'd long ago learned to file away, processed and stored where they couldn't cause damage. What he thought about was fractions and cookies, and whether Sophie had enough warm clothes for the field trip next week. He thought about the leak under the bathroom sink he'd been meaning to fix, and the parent-teacher conference on Thursday, and the way his daughter's face lit up when she solved a problem on her own. At 10:30, he checked the locks twice, verified the windows, and went to bed. The next morning, he arrived at Meridian Tower at exactly 6:15, 45 minutes before his shift officially began. He liked the building when it was empty, the way his footsteps echoed through the marble lobby, the way the early light came through the eastern windows and turned everything gold. Raymond Briggs was already at the security desk, the same position he'd held for 19 years. He was 64 years old with a gray mustache and kind eyes. A former Marine who'd done 2 tours in Vietnam and never talked about it unless asked directly. "Morning, Cole." "Morning, Ray." It was the same exchange they'd had every day for the past 14 months, ever since Marcus had started at Meridian Tower. 2 men who recognized something in each other, something that didn't require explanation or elaboration. But today, Raymond hesitated. His coffee cup stopped halfway to his mouth, and something flickered across his weathered face. "Saw what happened yesterday," he said finally. "In the conference room." Marcus continued signing in, his handwriting neat and precise. "That's not what I saw." "Then you saw wrong." Raymond set down his coffee. He studied Marcus for a long moment, the way you study a map when you're looking for something you're not sure exists. And then, almost unconsciously, a word slipped out. "Nightfall." The lobby went silent. Marcus's pen stopped moving. For exactly 2 seconds, something passed between the 2 men. Something that didn't belong in a corporate building at 6 in the morning. Something that belonged to a different world entirely. Then Marcus finished signing his name and looked up. His face was perfectly neutral. "I don't know what that means," but Raymond's hands were trembling slightly as he picked up his coffee. "No," he said quietly. "I suppose you don't." Marcus collected his supplies and headed for the service elevator. Behind him, Raymond Briggs stared at the signature on the logbook, his mind racing through decades of memories, through briefings and operations and stories passed down through military channels like mythology. Nightfall. The word hung in the air long after Marcus had disappeared. In the building's HR department, a woman named Patricia Chen was having an unusual morning. As Director of Human Resources, she'd processed thousands of employee files over her 20-year career. She knew how to read between the lines, how to spot inconsistencies, how to identify the things people tried to hide. Marcus Cole's file should have been unremarkable. Janitor, hired 14 months ago. Background check clear. References solid, though notably sparse. Showed up on time, did his work, never complained. The kind of employee you forgot existed until you needed the floors cleaned. But Patricia had been in the conference room yesterday. She'd seen him kneel down and clean that spill while Victoria Ashford's words hung in the air like poison. And something about his stillness had bothered her. Not the stillness of submission or embarrassment, but the stillness of something waiting, something controlled. She pulled his file again. Read through it carefully. And then she noticed the gaps. His employment history showed various maintenance jobs over the past 3 years, but before that, nothing. No college listed, no military service marked. Just a blank space where 8 years of his life should have been, explained away with a single line. Self-employed contractor. Patricia had seen this pattern before, usually in files that came with unofficial phone calls from government agencies, files that were meant to be approved without questions. But no one had ever called about Marcus Cole. She was still staring at the file when her office door opened. Patricia. Victoria Ashford stood in the doorway, her expression the same polished mask she always wore. I need the quarterly performance reviews by end of day. Of course. Patricia closed the file, but not before Victoria's eyes flickered to the name on the tab. Why are you looking at the janitor's file? Routine audit. We do them randomly. Victoria's smile didn't reach her eyes. Let me know if you find anything interesting. She left, and Patricia sat very still for a long moment. Then she picked up her phone and called a number she hadn't used in 5 years. A former colleague now working for a federal agency whose name she wasn't supposed to know. I need a favor, she said, and I need you to not ask why. 2 floors up, in a maintenance closet that smelled of industrial cleaner, Marcus Cole was sorting supplies. His movements were automatic, practiced, leaving his mind free to process the morning's single anomaly. Raymond Briggs knew, or suspected, or remembered something from a past life that most people had forgotten. Nightfall. A word that wasn't supposed to exist anymore, attached to operations that had never officially happened, carried out by men whose names had been erased from every database that mattered. Marcus had made his choice 3 years ago. He'd walked away from that life, away from the only thing he'd ever been truly good at, because a little girl needed a father more than the country needed another ghost. He'd built this new existence carefully, deliberately. Every decision designed to create distance from the person he used to be, and now a single word threatened to collapse all of it. He finished sorting the supplies, checked his watch, started his rounds. The building treated him the same as always, invisible, beneath notice, exactly what he needed to be. But in the security office, Raymond Briggs was making a phone call of his own. And in the HR department, Patricia Chen was waiting for a callback that would change everything she thought she knew about the quiet man who cleaned the floors. By the end of the week, the building's power structure had begun to shift in ways that no one could quite explain. It started small, almost imperceptibly, like the first cracks in a dam that no one thinks to inspect. Senior Vice President Thomas Whitmore began nodding to Marcus in the hallways. Not the casual acknowledgement you give the staff, but something more deliberate, more careful. Thomas was 62 years old, a former Army colonel who'd spent 20 years in military intelligence before transitioning to corporate security consulting. He'd been at Meridian Tower for a decade, and in all that time, no one had ever seen him acknowledge a janitor. Chief Financial Officer Robert Chen, Patricia's husband, started finding reasons to be in the lobby when Marcus signed in each morning. He never spoke, never approached. He just watched, the way you watch a chessboard when you're trying to understand a move you didn't see coming. And in the executive suite, Victoria Ashford noticed. "Why is everyone acting strange around the janitor?" she asked her assistant during their morning briefing. "I haven't noticed anything," Thomas Whitmore nodded to him yesterday. Thomas Whitmore doesn't nod to anyone below VP level. Her assistant, a young woman named Jennifer who had learned early to say nothing that could be used against her, kept her eyes on her tablet. Maybe he's just being friendly. Victoria didn't respond, but she began watching more carefully, tracking the small interactions that rippled through her building like stones dropped in still water, and she noticed something else, something that made her deeply uncomfortable. People stopped talking when Marcus Cole walked by. Not because they were afraid of him, but because they were afraid of what they might accidentally say. The word spread the way secrets always do in closed environments, through glances and half-finished sentences and conversations that stopped mid-word. Military. Something classified. Something that made grown men nervous. Victoria had built her career on information, on knowing things before anyone else, on leveraging that knowledge into power. But this was information she couldn't access, couldn't verify, couldn't control. And that made Marcus Cole dangerous. She found herself watching him during his rounds. The way he moved, economical and precise, never a wasted motion. The way he seemed to catalog every entrance, every exit, every blind spot in the security cameras. The way his eyes tracked movement even when the rest of his body remained perfectly still. Those weren't the habits of a janitor. Those were the habits of something else entirely. She called Thomas Whitmore into her office. "I want to know what you know about the janitor." Thomas, who had survived 3 wars and 17 years of corporate politics, smiled pleasantly. "Which janitor? Don't play games with me, Thomas." "I'm not playing anything." He settled into the chair across from her desk, relaxed and unhurried. "I'm telling you there are some questions that don't have answers you want to hear." "What does that mean?" "It means that some men leave certain lives and don't want to be found. It means that asking too many questions about those men can attract attention that you don't want. And it means—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "It means that the worst thing you could do right now is make an enemy of someone whose past you don't understand." Victoria leaned forward. "Is that a threat?" "It's advice. From someone who's seen what happens when powerful people underestimate quiet men." He stood, buttoning his jacket. "Leave the janitor alone, Victoria, for your own sake." He left, and Victoria sat in her empty office, feeling something she hadn't felt in years. Uncertainty. The incident happened on a Thursday afternoon, during the building's monthly fire drill. Except this wasn't a drill. The smoke alarm triggered at 2:47. A piercing wail that sent 3,000 employees streaming toward the stairwells. Protocol was clear. Evacuate immediately, assemble at designated points, wait for the all-clear. But on the 31st floor, something had gone wrong. A transformer had blown in the electrical room, sending sparks into a storage closet filled with paper supplies and cleaning chemicals. The sprinkler system activated but malfunctioned, flooding the wrong area while flames began to spread through the walls. Marcus was on the 32nd floor when he smelled the smoke. Not the faint chemical smell of the alarm test, but something real, something burning. He moved without thinking, without permission, dropping his mop and heading for the stairwell. On the 31st floor, he found chaos. Smoke pouring from the electrical room. Sprinklers creating a lake of water that was spreading toward the server room, and 3 IT employees trapped behind a fallen ceiling tile. The fire department was 7 minutes away. The building security team was focused on evacuation. No one was coming. Marcus assessed the situation in 2 seconds flat. Structural integrity compromised in the southeast corner, fire spreading through the wall toward the server room. 3 civilians trapped, 1 with an apparent leg injury. 2 exits available, 1 blocked by debris. 1 threatened by approaching flames. He moved. The first IT employee, a young man frozen with fear, was physically lifted and pointed toward the clear exit. "Go. Don't stop. Don't look back." The second employee, a woman trying to help her injured colleague, looked up at Marcus with desperate eyes. "I can't carry him." I can." Marcus pulled the injured man onto his shoulders in a fireman's carry so smooth it looked rehearsed. Because it had been, hundreds of times, in situations far worse than this. They made it to the stairwell just as the ceiling collapsed behind them. In the lobby, Victoria Ashford was directing evacuation efforts when the 3 IT employees emerged from the stairwell, followed by Marcus carrying the injured man. Fire crews were just arriving, paramedics rushing forward with stretchers, the organized chaos of emergency response unfolding exactly as it should. But then, Raymond Briggs made his mistake. He'd been coordinating with police at the main entrance when he saw Marcus emerge, saw the way he moved, the way he'd handled the situation, the controlled precision that didn't belong to any janitor he'd ever known. And before he could stop himself, the word came out. "Nightfall," he said it loud enough to carry. Loud enough for Thomas Whitmore to turn sharply. Loud enough for Victoria Ashford to hear. Loud enough for a dozen other people to fall suddenly silent, their eyes locked on the janitor covered in soot and ceiling dust, the injured man still draped across his shoulders. The lobby went quiet. Even the emergency crews seemed to pause, sensing something they didn't understand. Marcus handed the injured man to the waiting paramedics. He didn't acknowledge Raymond's shout. He didn't explain or defend or clarify. He simply turned and walked toward the side exit, his stride unchanged, his expression neutral. But Victoria had seen something in that moment. The way Thomas Whitmore's face had gone pale, the way Robert Chen had stepped back, the way a single word had transformed the atmosphere of the entire lobby. "What the hell is Nightfall?" she demanded. No one answered her. Marcus didn't return to work the next day. He called in sick for the first time in 14 months, and Patricia Chen didn't question it. Thomas Whitmore sent flowers to Sophie's school with a card that said only "thank you" with no signature. Raymond Briggs took an unexpected vacation day and spent it sitting in his car outside Marcus's apartment building, watching and waiting and trying to decide what to do with information he wasn't supposed to have. The truth, when it finally emerged, came not through questions, but through connections. Patricia's contact at the federal agency called back with a voice that was very, very careful. "The file you're asking about doesn't exist. That's not possible. Everyone has a file. Not everyone." A long pause. "Patricia, I need you to listen to me very carefully. The man you're asking about, he left a certain organization 3 years ago under circumstances that are classified above my pay grade. There are maybe a dozen people in the country who know his real service record, and half of them are dead. The ones who are still alive, they don't talk about him. Ever. Why not? Because he was very good at a job that required being invisible, and because he walked away from that job to raise his daughter after his wife died." Another pause. "Leave him alone. Let him have his peace." Patricia hung up and sat very still for a long time. When Victoria Ashford came to her office demanding answers, Patricia told her the only truth that mattered. "He's a janitor. That's all he wants to be. And if you're smart, that's all you'll let him be." Victoria wasn't smart. She never had been. She dug deeper, pulled strings, called contacts who owed her favors, and slowly, in fragments and whispers and pieces that didn't quite fit together, a picture emerged. Special operations, deep cover. The kind of missions that never made the news because they never officially happened. A man who had spent 8 years as a ghost, moving through the world's darkest places, doing the things that allowed people like her to sleep safely at night. And then, a car accident, a dead wife, a traumatized daughter, a choice between continuing to serve and being a father. He'd chosen fatherhood. He'd walked away from everything, buried his identity, taken the most anonymous job he could find, and spent 3 years being invisible in a different way. Until she had humiliated him in front of 200 people for a coffee stain he hadn't even caused. Victoria Ashford had built her career on never apologizing. Apologies were weakness, admission of error. blood in the water for the sharks that circled every corporate leader. She hadn't apologized when she'd fired a pregnant employee for performance issues. She hadn't apologized when she'd tanked a competitor's stock with a well-timed rumor. She hadn't apologized for any of the countless small cruelties that had carried her to the corner office, but now she stood outside a small apartment in Cicero, holding a bottle of wine she didn't know how to offer, trying to form words she'd never learned to say. The door opened. Marcus stood there in jeans and a faded army t-shirt, his daughter visible behind him, watching television on a second-hand couch. "Miss Ashford." His voice was neutral, neither welcoming nor hostile. "This is unexpected. I came to apologize. You could have done that at work." "No, I couldn't have." She took a breath. "May I come in?" He studied her for a long moment, then stepped aside. The apartment was small but clean, walls lined with children's artwork, the smell of something baking drifting from the kitchen. Sophie looked up from her cartoon, curious but unafraid. "Sophie, this is someone from Daddy's work. Can you give us a few minutes?" "Okay." The little girl gathered her things and disappeared into her room, leaving them alone. Victoria sat on the edge of a worn armchair, suddenly aware of how out of place her designer clothes looked in this space. "I know about you. Not everything, but enough. I'm aware. I'm not here because of that. I'm not here because Thomas Whitmore told me to leave you alone, or because Patricia Chen warned me off, or because I'm afraid of whatever you used to be." She met his eyes. "I'm here because I was wrong. What I did in that conference room, it was wrong. It would have been wrong even if you were exactly what I thought you were, just a janitor, just someone beneath me. The fact that you're something else doesn't make my behavior worse. It was already as bad as it could be." Marcus said nothing. He stood by the window, watching her with the same calm attention he gave everything. "I've spent my entire career believing that power means never having to apologize. That showing weakness, any weakness, is invitation to attack." She laughed softly, without humor. "But you have more power in your silence than I've ever had in my loudest moments. And you don't use it. You let people underestimate you. You let them be cruel. Why? Because what they think of me doesn't change who I am. Doesn't it bother you, being treated like you're nothing?" Marcus looked at the photograph on his wall, the one of Emily and Sophie on the beach 2 weeks before the accident. "I spent 8 years being treated like I didn't exist, intentionally, by design. I learned that invisibility is a choice, not a punishment." He turned back to her. "You can only be humiliated if you agree to feel humiliated." I didn't agree. Victoria absorbed this. "I'm sorry," she said finally. "Not because of who you are, because of who I was in that moment." Apology accepted. She stood to leave, then hesitated. "The man who spilled that coffee, the junior analyst, he let you take the blame. He watched me humiliate you, and he said nothing. I know. Why didn't you defend yourself?" Marcus walked her to the door. "Because defending myself would have cost him his career. He's 23 years old with student loans and a sick mother. I'm a janitor. The stakes weren't equal." Victoria stopped in the doorway. "You protected him, even while I was attacking you, protecting people who can't protect themselves. It's what I do. What I've always done." He opened the door. "Good night, Miss Ashford." She left, and somewhere between his apartment and her car, Victoria Ashford began to understand that power had nothing to do with titles, or money, or the ability to make people afraid. It had to do with choices. Monday morning, Victoria was waiting outside the maintenance office when Marcus arrived for his shift. She looked different somehow, less armored, the careful mask she always wore slightly askew. "I have a proposal. I'm listening." Head of Building Security. Full benefits, salary commensurate with experience, flexible hours so you can be home when Sophie needs you. She paused. Thomas Whitmore recommended you. He said you're the most qualified person he's ever met for the position." Marcus considered this. "Did he tell you what qualified means in this context?" "He told me enough. I don't want a job because of what I used to be." "I'm not offering you a job because of what you used to be. I'm offering you a job because of what you did on the 31st floor, because you ran toward the fire when everyone else ran away, because you carried a man twice your size down 15 flights of stairs without breaking stride." She met his eyes. "And because you've spent 14 months doing a job beneath your abilities without once complaining or trying to leverage your past into something better. That's the qualification that matters. And if I say no, then you stay a janitor and I leave you alone. This isn't pressure, Marcus. It's an offer. Take it or don't." He thought about Sophie, about the parent-teacher conferences he'd missed, the school plays that conflicted with his shift schedule, the weekends spent catching up on sleep instead of teaching her to ride a bike. He thought about Emily, about the promise he'd made her in those final moments at the hospital, the promise to be there for their daughter no matter what. He thought about the life he'd built, small and quiet and invisible, and whether that life was what Sophie needed or just what he thought he deserved. "I have conditions. Name them. I set my own hours around Sophie's schedule. I don't travel. I don't carry a weapon on the premises. And no one, ever, asks me about my past. Not officially, not casually, not as a test. If I hear the word nightfall again, I'm gone." Victoria nodded slowly. "Anything else?" "The junior analyst who spilled the coffee. David Morrison. He's been killing himself with guilt since that day. You owe him an apology too." She stiffened, then forced herself to relax. "I'll speak with him." "Don't speak with him. Apologize to him. In front of the same people who watched you humiliate me. Let them see that power can be used for something other than intimidation." Victoria stared at him. "You're asking me to publicly admit I was wrong. I'm asking you to publicly be better." A long silence stretched between them. Then, remarkably, Victoria Ashford laughed, a genuine sound that seemed to surprise even her. "You know, most people in your position would use this moment for revenge. You could have destroyed my career. One phone call to the right person and I'd be finished. Revenge is expensive. It costs you the person you want to be." She extended her hand. "We have a deal, Mr. Cole." He shook it. "Marcus. Marcus." She smiled, and for the first time it reached her eyes. "Welcome to management." 3 months later, Meridian Tower had changed in ways both visible and invisible. The security protocols were tighter now, but somehow less oppressive. Staff who had once walked with their eyes down began to move more freely, more confidently. The invisible lines between departments, between ranks, between the powerful and the powerless, had begun to blur. Victoria Ashford still ran her department with precision and high expectations. But she'd started learning names, started asking about families, started acknowledging that the people who kept her building running deserved more than contempt. She'd apologized to David Morrison in front of the entire quarterly meeting, the same venue where she'd humiliated Marcus. It had been awkward, uncomfortable, nothing like the polished performances she was known for. It had also been real, and the ripple effects of that reality were still spreading. Raymond Briggs retired at the end of the month. His final act, a handshake with Marcus that said everything words couldn't capture. Two men who understood each other's pasts, respecting each other's choices. Patricia Chen occasionally caught herself watching Marcus during his rounds, still amazed at how thoroughly he'd hidden in plain sight. But she never asked questions. Some mysteries were better left unsolved, and Marcus Cole, former ghost, former instrument of national security, father of one and widower of the only woman he'd ever loved, walked the halls of Meridian Tower with the same quiet purpose he brought to everything. He still arrived early. He still left exactly on time. He still wore his uniform with the same crisp precision, though now it bore the title Director of Security instead of Maintenance Staff. But the job hadn't changed him. The title hadn't changed him. What had changed was the world's willingness to see him clearly, to recognize that worth and status were not the same thing, had never been the same thing. On the last Friday of the month, Sophie's school held its spring concert. She'd auditioned for the solo, just like he'd suggested. She hadn't gotten it, but she'd tried, and that trying had led to other things. A speaking part in the school play, a new confidence that showed in the way she held her shoulders. Marcus sat in the third row of the auditorium, still in his uniform because he'd come directly from work. The other parents glanced at him, at the security badge clipped to his belt, making assumptions that didn't matter. When Sophie's class took the stage, her eyes found him immediately. She waved, small and quick, a gesture just for him. He waved back. The concert ended. Parents collected children. The auditorium emptied in the controlled chaos of families reuniting at the end of the day. Sophie took his hand as they walked to the car. "Daddy?" "What's nightfall?" Marcus stopped. "Where did you hear that word?" Mrs. Patterson's grandson was visiting. "He's in the army. He saw your picture and said something about it." She looked up at him with Emily's eyes. "Is it a secret?" He knelt down, bringing himself to her level. "It's a name from a long time ago. From before you were born, before I met your mother. It belongs to someone I used to be." "Who were you?" "Someone who did hard things because they needed to be done. Someone who made mistakes. Someone who eventually learned that the most important job in the world is being your dad." Sophie considered this with the serious expression she got when working on fractions. "Is that why you're so good at fixing things?" He smiled. "Something like that. And that's why you always know where all the exits are. That too." She threw her arms around his neck. "I'm glad you're my dad instead of Nightfall." "Me too, sweetheart. Me too." They drove home through the evening traffic, Sophie chattering about the concert and her friends and the brownies she wanted to make this weekend. The ordinary music of an ordinary life, hard-won and precious. At 5:45, Marcus pulled into his parking space at the apartment complex. At 5:46, he opened the door and let Sophie run ahead. At 5:47, he stood in his small kitchen and looked at the refrigerator covered in children's artwork, at the photograph of Emily that smiled from the counter, at the life he'd chosen when he walked away from everything else. No medals, no recognition, no mythology, just a man, doing his best to be a father, surrounded by people who finally saw him for who he truly was. And that, he understood now, was the only identity that had ever really mattered.